All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Beaver, and I serve as a member of the Alumni Engagement Team here at Valparaiso University. And tonight we are thrilled to welcome you to Pandemic Parenting, which is one of our new virtual events. Our program this evening is presented by Professor Amanda Zelechoski. And I'm getting feedback because I forgot to mute my other thing. So here we go. Sorry about that. Amanda Zelechoski joined the Valparaiso University faculty in 2011. She's a licensed attorney and clinical psychologist specializing in the areas of trauma and forensic psychology. She is board certified in clinical child and adolescent psychology and has worked clinically with adults, children, and families in inpatient, outpatient, and forensic settings. Dr. Zelechoski directs the Psychology, Law, and Trauma Lab, and her primary research interests include forensic and mental health assessment, at-risk, delinquent, and traumatized youth, child custody, and child welfare, and the intersection of psychology, law, and public policy. Dr. Zelechoski also conducts forensic and psychological evaluations and provides training and consultation to numerous mental health, legal, criminal justice, child welfare, and education agencies. Outside of the classroom and lab, Dr. Zelechoski and her husband enjoyed trying to keep up with their 3 sons and feisty yellow lab. We invite you to relax and enjoy her presentation. You may submit live questions via the YouTube chat on the right-hand side, I believe, or by emailing them to our email address, which is alumni@valpo.edu. Again, that's alumni@valpo.edu. We'll get to as many as we can during the presentation. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Zelechoski.
Thank you so much, Michael. Hi, everybody. We're probably catching a lot of you at dinner and bedtime chaos. And so I feel all of those things. But I am so privileged and honored to get to be with you and to talk about a topic that I know is near and dear to many of our hearts because we are still in it. And so, we're going to talk about a lot of different things as it relates to our parenting and our coping in this pandemic. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Okay. So pandemic parenting, using the psychological science to help us cope. There's my information there. If you ever want to reach out, I'm going to talk about some of the resources that we've created at pandemicparent.org, and as well as my social media handles where I like to post lots of resources that could be helpful. So I encourage you to follow that account if any of these resources feel like things that you'd like to follow or stay connected to. So using the psychological science to help us cope, let me tell you a little bit about how it came to be that I am talking to you about this topic, because as Michael noted, I am a forensic psychologist. So I spend most of my time, clinically in terms of teaching and research in criminal justice settings, in jails and prisons and juvenile detention facilities, and just interfacing with the law. And while there are certainly aspects of that touch on family functioning, my focus in that realm tends to be on trauma, on child trauma, and how that impacts people's life trajectories such that they end up finding themselves involved in the criminal justice system in some way. So that is where I usually spend a lot of my thinking and my time. But I have done quite a pivot in the last 7-8 months, as we all have in many different ways. And so let me share a little bit about, what I mean by that. So how this all started. So this is with my youngest son, Jack, who is 4, and we are in our pajamas in the middle of the day. And this was like mid-March when this all happened. And all of a sudden we found ourselves in this pandemic, right? Home, pivoting in so many ways, abruptly, not knowing what this meant, how long this would be. This is a picture one of my older sons happened to just snap when he had, stolen my phone and probably wasn't supposed to be playing on it. And when I saw this later, what I loved about this picture, because I remembered that day, it was a pretty rough day. We were fighting the older kids on remote learning, and I was trying to work and be on meetings and manage all this stuff. And so was my husband. And It was a rough day. But at some point, my son caught this moment of just sort of tranquility, right? A moment of peace and calm in the middle of what I remember to be a really tough day. But he somehow captured this really peaceful moment in the midst of that chaos. So this was how the pandemic started. And the reason I also love this picture so much is because it reflects to me like what it was we all were facing in many ways, and not all the same, right? Our experiences were very different. Many of us were working, some of you were essential workers, trying to still figure out how it is to do your job while maybe your kids were home all of a sudden. There are single parents among us. There are those of us trying to co-parent when we have been separated or divorced. And so managing all of that, this looks so different for every family. But there were ways that it was the same for all of us, which was just this like, how are we going to do this? What just happened? So this made me, think about, if any of you are big on social media, you've seen over the last like week or so, all these sort of how it started versus how it ended. And that's kind of when I was thinking about this presentation tonight. That picture came to mind, like how it started. That was in sort of the first week of all of this. And this is the kind of how it ended. This was an article in the Washington Post not too long ago about this work that I'm going to tell you about tonight, and some of the resources that I hope will be helpful for you. So that is, I guess, my version of the how it started, how it ended. But let me tell you a little bit about this project and again, the resources that I hope will be helpful for you. Michael mentioned that I am also trained as a lawyer, and so I would not be a good lawyer if I didn't start this with some of the disclaimers that are important to give. So nothing that we talk about tonight, questions that we answer, suggestions I give, I don't want anybody to construe those as sort of individual advice or therapy. I'm just trying to sort of give general, feedback, comments, ideas. Another major disclaimer is that I am not a perfect parent, far from it. And I don't have all the answers, but I will do my best to, and have been trying to do my best to provide resources, use the psychological training and knowledge I've been so privileged to have to help others. I also realize that everybody's situation is different, that there are different layers of privilege at play when it comes to some of the decisions we've each had to make in our respective families, the resources we might have or not have. And so I think it's important to just sort of honor and name that there are layers of privilege here that make our circumstances different sometimes. So I'm not here to tell you that anything is the right way to do something and that there's only one way to do things, but just that I hope to present some information that'll be helpful to you that comes from the psychological science. Okay, so those are my disclaimers. So to give you some context on this project that has now come to be known as pandemic parenting. In the spring of 2020, as I mentioned, when this started, toward the end of February, we were getting some wind of it. I had a couple conferences and such that first week of spring, and so even then I remember we were sort of like, should I travel? Is it safe to travel? All those kinds of things we were thinking about. And right as I got back from those conferences, it was the, first week-ish of March, we knew this was about to get bad, right? Or many of us kind of got that sense that, okay, this is coming, this is getting bad, things are about to change pretty significantly. And as a trauma researcher and somebody who studies crises like these and how it impacts people, I also had these moments of recognizing like, this is going to get really bad for kids, right? Because when you have children potentially, now locked down and isolated at home, you have extremely stressed parents, financial stress, losing jobs, inability to kind of get space from each other, just all kinds of increased stress. What that often means is that child maltreatment rates increase pretty significantly. And so my fear in that also was, how do we manage child maltreatment and keep an eye on these things? A lot of times it's our schools, right? It's the teachers who are making those child welfare hotline calls. And so I remember being really worried in the beginning, like this is about to get really bad as far as child maltreatment goes, and the longer this goes on. So recognizing that, the other thing that was playing around in my mind was, this is also the first time I can ever remember in my lifetime that we knew a trauma was coming before it came on this national scale. So I've posted some other examples here, right? We learned a lot from 9/11, from Hurricane Katrina. We've learned a lot after school shootings about how these kinds of national or global crises impact children and families. But we haven't had an opportunity like this. Opportunity is a terrible word to use, but a situation like this where we could actually know the crisis is coming and track it in real time. And so I thought about that too as a researcher, like maybe this is a unique situation where I can start to study this from the very beginning, get some baseline data as we think about it before it starts, as it's starting, and then track that. So I tried to figure out how I could do that really quickly. And remembered that I had some funding left over from a Valpo Alumni Association faculty development grant that actually I was supposed to use for finishing up a study I had been doing on trauma histories with incarcerated kids. And of course, I wasn't going to be able to finish that in the spring, was I? I wasn't going to be able to go in and interview these kids inside the juvenile detention facilities like I had hoped and planned. But I had this funding left over that then I thought, well, why not study families? Why not study right where the crisis is as it's happening? So that's what we did. So I launched on March 15th, 2020, the Coronavirus Family Impact Project. We had 455 parents participate from the very beginning. These were parents of kids, with kids that were in kindergarten through 12th grade. The average parent age was around 40 years old, and the average child age in the study was around 9 years old. Some of you may have even participated in this. I was just thrilled and grateful for the response from the Valparaiso University community, including our alumni, in participating, reaching out, all those kinds of things. So we surveyed parents 4 times at the beginning, right as it was starting for many families, just before their kids' schools shifted to remote learning. And then we asked the same questions again around 1 week, 1 month, and then 3 months to just sort of track what was happening for people over time. So I'll talk you through some of these just really brief findings, but basically parents provided us demographic information and completed assessments on several areas of stress, on their just general sort of perceived stress in their lives, on their parenting stress specifically, and on how their child was doing, right? Their child's adjustment over that 3-month period. So some of the things that you can see here, we saw parenting stress from March to June, of course, increase. So I hope you can see my cursor there. We saw those rates go up. Now, parents of younger children tended to report higher parenting stress over time, which I think makes sense. For those of us with younger kids that we were having to really just hands-on supervise, help them with their remote learning, be right there with them, which made it very difficult if you're also a working parent to tend to the things you needed to do for work. And so parents who had younger kids in kindergarten through 5th grade, tended to report higher parenting stress over time. But their levels of general stress didn't really seem to differ from parents of older kids. So it seemed that all parents were sort of feeling this certain level of stress, but parents of younger kids were feeling more stress specific to their parenting responsibilities. Approximately, or just under a fourth of kids were rated by their parents as showing clinical levels of what we call psychosocial difficulties from March to June. So kids were getting worse. They were showing more difficulty, emotional and behavioral problems over just even that 3-month period. We saw that younger kids were at relatively higher risk for what we call externalizing problems, acting out, aggression, anger, those kinds of things compared with older children, which also makes sense. Younger kids don't have as much ability, verbally to express their frustration or name what's going on for them, what they're feeling. Older kids tended to be at higher levels of what we call internalizing problems compared with younger kids. So becoming more withdrawn, depressed, quiet, not interested in activities they used to be interested. So we saw more of those internalizing problems for older kids over that 3-month period. So we're still analyzing a lot of this data, but overall, the sense that we're getting from it is that there was a lot of stress, of course, being transmitted between parents and children. Right? But the nature of how that stress was transmitted and what the impact was tended to depend on the developmental level of the child. Okay, so the relationship between how that stress kind of influenced each other between parent and child in some ways depended on the age or developmental status of the child. Okay, so I also just included a couple of the really, I think, interesting, what we call qualitative responses or open-ended responses that we were given. So we asked parents, what sort of things are they worried about? I'm worried about wanting to make sure my kids feel safe and stable during all the change, but I'm finding myself exhausted and impatient due to work stress. Second comment, I'm worried that people think homework and testing are more important than well-being. So we also asked, what their kids were worried about. And the way that we did that was to have parents ask their child the question and then give us their verbatim response. Exactly what did your child answer? And so I just wanted you to get a sense of the differences by age level. So a kindergartner responded, I'm worried about family that I love getting sick and not getting to hug anyone. I'm a hugger. I don't know how I can't hug anyone anymore. A third grader responded, I'm not worried. I know if we stay safe, we will not get it, meaning COVID-19. And then a seventh grader, I'm worried that I will get the coronavirus and pass it along to you, but you might get serious complications or even die. And then I would blame myself for the rest of my life. So you can just sort of see developmentally how kids were processing this information, what sort of things they were thinking about, that differed based on, of course, how old they are. So that's just a little snapshot of some of the things we learned from our study. And so what I wanted to just sort of explain is how this study, this little project, I thought, here's this opportunity to research this in real time, how it has come to change the trajectory of where I've been spending a lot of my time in trying to help parents. So the typical way, for those of you who may not know, that a lot of scientific findings like this will get published, it's a very long process, right? We spend months analyzing this data, writing it up, and then submitting it to various academic journals. So it may be, if I'm lucky, a year or so until this is published in a journal that then is accessible to people. Now, I don't know how many of you spend your time combing through academic journals, in your spare fun time, but not many people do. And so what that also means is that often the research that we do doesn't easily get into the hands of the people who need it and could most benefit from it. So I was thinking about that a lot this summer. Like, I'm learning so much from this data, and I don't know that any of us thought we'd be entering round 2 of this fall. I certainly didn't, right? As we wrapped up the study in June, like, oh, this is great. We'll learn some things about this that will, teach us things for future global crises or whatever down the road. But around July, when it started to become apparent, like, oh no, we're not done with this. We're about to do round 2, which I don't know about you all, but I just felt that sense of like dread, and we're like, how am I going to do this again? It was just, we could barely survive getting through the end of the school year, our kids' school year, and now we're going to do it again. And what's that going to look like? So knowing that, having a lot of conversations with friends and family and colleagues where I found myself giving a lot of advice, or just, hey, well, this is why you're feeling that. It's because you're feeling this cognitive load, and here's what's going on. And that started to help me remember, like, I have access sometimes, and again, I'm so lucky to have training and knowledge around some of these psychological concepts that I take for granted. And as I was having these conversations with people, realizing like, we have information that can be helpful to people right now. Can help reassure them, can help them feel like they're not alone in this, and can help them with some of the decisions they have to make in the months ahead. So I thought a lot about that, and like, I'm sitting on data that could be helpful right now. And what can we do about that? And there was a colleague of mine in Canada who did a very similar study, Dr. Lindsay Malloy, who I reached out to just sort of talk about this with, and said, hey, do you think there's a way we could get this out faster? And translate sometimes these really obscure psychological concepts in ways that can be helpful right now. And we had that conversation in the middle of July. And 2 weeks later, we launched Pandemic Parenting. So I just want to show you what I mean when I say pandemic parenting. And then I'm going to talk about some of these concepts that we have learned that I hope will be helpful to you. So this is the Pandemic Parenting website that we launched 2 weeks later. And our goal was to provide resources to parents in real time, so that, not only are you not alone, and we can sort of build this community of support in some ways, but science-informed resources. It is hard to tell, in our current era of all this sort of alleged fake news and which media outlets are biased and not, right? Especially at a very political time. It's hard to know what are trustworthy resources in the middle of a pandemic that we are still learning about, that we don't know necessarily all the answers as it relates to the risks of that pandemic, of that disease. So what we did was just start with webinars, and we've been doing webinars every 2 weeks ever since. So if you go to the resources page, and again, this is pandemic-parent.org. It's all free. Everything are free resources. That was always our intent, was to try to give psychology away in the easiest, most accessible ways possible. So you'll see a whole bunch of different topics here, and I'm going to give you some of the best hits tonight. But I just want you to know this is there. And for every topic, for example, the first one we did in August was all about making decisions relating to whether to send your kids back to school or do hybrid learning or do remote learning. People were really struggling at that time with these decisions, and many still are as schools continue to readjust how they're delivering instruction. So we always post the recording of the webinar if you can't join us live. There are always resources. We have vetted every article and resource that we post to feel confident in the fact that it is science informed and accurate and reliable information. We always include, additional sort of tips and guidance, and then reflection questions, because our hope is that you will take this information in your various communities, Zoom happy hours with your friends, in your organizations, and use them to facilitate conversations and continue to build this community of support with other parents struggling in the same ways that you might be, that I have been. And so we just encourage you to take the resources, use them. We're posting on social media all the time, different snippets and things and quotes we've learned from different experts. And so anyway, so that's how pandemic parenting was born. And we sure thought this was going to be something very short term. Oh, we'll do this for a few months while it's helpful, and then, we'll resume our lives because the pandemic will be over by then, right? And that's sure not the case. And we've had quite a few people tell us to buckle our seatbelts and be ready for the long haul, because even when the pandemic is over, whatever that means and whenever that is, the mental health fallout of this is we're going to be feeling for many years to come, unfortunately. And so Lindsay and I are, again, very humbled and honored and privileged to be able to share and give psychology away in ways that we hope continue to be helpful for people. And we're committed to doing that as long as we can and as long as it's helpful to people. So I will just, before I forget, let you know that the webinar we're doing this week on Thursday is called Pregnant During a Pandemic: Resources and Support for Before, During, and After Pregnancy. And we usually do these on Thursday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern, trying to best meet parents' needs around bedtime and, after a long day, kids are in bed, that then you can engage rather than doing this kind of in the middle of the workday or something like that. But know that everything is always recorded. So if you can't ever make it live, it's no problem. It'll be there within a few days. So that's what we're doing this week. And then in 2 weeks, I'm very excited about some of the experts we have coming to talk to us about anti-racist pandemic parenting. And I think that's just going to be a really important conversation for us to have, that we should continue to have. Okay, so that is where you can find resources and support. And now let me just give you some of those best hits. So how can the psychological science help us right now? These are some of the topics that parents have asked us to talk about that we've felt like was really important, emerging from different conversations and research studies that are coming out every day, every week. We're learning lots and lots about how people are being impacted about this. So I just want to talk about a few of these concepts that I really hope help you feel that you're not alone, and that if you are struggling right now to manage all of the things, that those are normal responses. And hopefully some of these things I'll share with you will give you some comfort and maybe even some guidance around ways to manage those sorts of things. So let me start with this idea of decision fatigue, which is not a term that many were familiar with. And then again, this summer, we started to see a lot of articles being published about it, people talking about this term. And it was something that I took for granted, that people aren't always as familiar with. So the term itself was coined by social psychologist Roy Baumeister. It's essentially this idea that, when we are having to make lots of decisions over and over a lengthy period of time, we become weary. And our ability to make good decisions is impacted because we're just exhausted by this. So if you think about, since March, the amount of decisions you've had to make, there are normally a lot of decisions we're having to make as parents, right? For our kids, and that can be stressful. But when you layer on top of it, this sort of day by day, hour by hour, is it safe for me to go to the grocery store? Can I do that? Can I bring my child? What if we can't get this that we need? Can I let my child play outside with his friends? Is it okay to have a relative come over? Like, we were doing this every day, multiple times a day, trying to constantly balance these, the risks and benefits, when we weren't clear on what the risks and benefits were. And so what that resulted in was this idea of decision fatigue. And so becoming just exhausted, which then impacts our ability to make decisions. And when we are traumatized, which I would certainly argue that what we have been experiencing the last 7 months is a collective trauma. Okay. So there are individual traumas, people experience, but as a global society, as a community, This has been a collective trauma we've been going through that we also don't know when it's going to end, which adds to that sort of weariness and fatigue. So when we are traumatized, or at a minimum, under extreme stress, we lose our ability to generate creative solutions. We lose our ability to say, oh, well, here's a way to think about that. Or maybe I can try this new strategy with my child who is railing against me every time I try to get her to sit down and do her e-learning. In other contexts, I might be able to be more creative, come up with the most beautiful sticker chart in the world for positive reinforcement. But there were no more reserves, right? We were exhausted. That you had nothing left after trying to manage this stuff all day long. So we lose our ability to create these, to generate these creative solutions, and we experience this fatigue. So in our research and in my colleague, Dr. Malloy's research, we were seeing parents use words like drained, paralyzed, blocked. They couldn't make simple decisions about things like what to eat, what to do next, which work task to tackle next. Decisions like that were so simple. What should we have for dinner tonight? Were bringing people to tears. And I know I felt that at times. Like, I just have no more reserve. I don't know. I felt that a lot. Many days, those were the responses to my kids. I don't know, because we just had it. We didn't have that ability. We just had this fatigue. And then you're feeling like, what's wrong with me? These are things that I easily could do a month ago. Like, why can't I pull it together? And so it's this phenomenon of decision fatigue. It's this long period of relentless decision making, of triaging day in and day out, hour to hour. What's the thing I have to get done right now? That compounded that, right? And made us so fatigued when it seemed like really simple decisions, but they actually weren't. So I wanted you to just be familiar with that concept. And then, these are some tips that you can try when it comes to decision fatigue, because we're not done making decisions, right? Maybe we as parents, especially of, maybe younger kids, school age kids, were having to make all these school decisions. And then it was like, whew, okay, fine. And for some people, that decision was made for you, and that was frustrating, right? For other people, you had to decide between remote learning, hybrid learning, in-person learning, so for others, you didn't have the ability to make a decision because you're an essential worker. And so you didn't have the luxury of deciding to keep your child home maybe for remote learning, even though that's what you felt you wanted to do. So we went through this period of making a bunch of decisions. And then, I don't know about for you, but I started to feel some relief. Like, okay, in school is what it is. It's going to be what it is. My kids have been quarantined on and off at different points in time. Like, we're just going to keep adjusting, being adaptable and flexible. So at least we're done making a lot of those decisions, right? Wrong. What period are we coming up on? The holidays. And the holidays are filled with complicated decisions in a normal circumstance, right? Who are we going to spend it with? Are we going to do this differently? Like, holidays can be very stressful, and as it relates to making decisions. But now we layer on top of it this pandemic situation where we can't do our usual decision making, right? Or maybe we want to do something, but we're inhibited, we're just prohibited from doing that because of safety concerns, or, whatever the case might be. So we're not done making decisions, and we won't be for a while. And so I just wanted to give you some tips on managing this decision fatigue. So I'll just highlight a couple of these. Don't make major decisions when you're feeling dysregulated. For me, that's often at night, right? I'm tired. It's been a long day. I'm vulnerable. And so I rarely ever make good decisions late into the evening hours, and it's always better or recommended for me to sleep on it, which my husband has to remind me a lot. Like, you're fired up right now. Just promise me you won't send that email until tomorrow morning when you've read it one more time, right? Because I'm dysregulated. I'm amped up, or I'm tired, and I'm just not at my best decision making, or my judgment isn't firing on all cylinders right now. So just try to be mindful of your own patterns of when you're dysregulated, because it is not the time to make a major decision. And the second one I know was really critical for my family, especially during those initial few months of lockdown, trying to limit the decisions we had to make each day. I pushed back against, like, you saw probably many of you on social media, all these examples of like, here's the, homeschool schedule, or the COVID-19 home routine. And it was all these like great examples of schedules you could make. And I pushed back against that, because it was just like, no, I'm not doing that. I have to do that so much in my work. Like, we're just going to figure it out. And that was the wrong approach, right? My kids needed that structure. They needed to know what was coming next. They needed to know when to plan. Like, even if we were doing some fun things like watching a movie as a family in the middle of the day, they just needed to know what was coming. because so much in their life, so much of that control was taken away from them. They didn't have predictability anymore. They went to school on a Friday and they didn't get to go back. And so as much as we can limit the number of decisions we're having to make, which also helps to give some structure and control and predictability back into our households, it helps with this decision fatigue, because it was like, all right, this is just our schedule and there may be days we need to adjust it, but at least I'm not having to decide every hour what we're going to do next. I've limited the amount of decisions I have to make each day. So you just have a couple of other tips there. The only other two I'll highlight is that third one, which is this notion of, it works until it doesn't. I think a lot of times when we make decisions, it feels so permanent. Like I'll just go back to the school one as an example. Like, okay, I have to make this decision. Am I sending my kid, back to face-to-face learning or not? Or am I keeping them home for remote learning? And it feels like this big, huge, permanent decision. But the reality is it's probably not as permanent or unchangeable as you think. There are very few decisions we make that are 100% permanent and you cannot change or adjust. There are very few. So keeping in mind this idea that, okay, this is the decision we're making right now with the information we have right now, based on what we think is the best for our family right now. That might change in 2 weeks. And so this will work until it doesn't. And then we can make a new decision if we have to. Okay, so trying to take away that doom and gloom of what feels like permanency when it may not have to be as permanent as you're anticipating. And then the last one there you see, number 7, is a nod to, maybe some of you had this experience. I think I watched Frozen 2 with my kids no less than 100 times during this quarantine period. And I loved that song by Anna, that she sings at one point, this idea of just doing the next right thing. As I thought about how much I was triaging every day, okay, what is the thing I have to get done right now? What's more important? Does my child need me in this way? Or can I stick him in front of a movie for an hour so that I can respond to these work emails or teach my class or whatever it was? It was just continuing, instead of staring down the abyss of what the next few months might look like. What is the next right thing I need to do right now? And just continuing to kind of try to make decisions that way, instead of feeling like everything was so big and overwhelming as far as what I'd have to decide. So channel your inner Anna from Frozen 2 and trying to just keep focused on what is the next right thing. So those are just some tips around, this idea of decision fatigue. But I think it's most important to really just name and acknowledge that we're feeling that, and that is okay, and that is a normal psychological response to the situation that we're in. It doesn't mean that you're not competent, that you don't have it together, all these other things necessarily. It's just that, yeah, I am feeling this decision fatigue, and no wonder I'm not able to, make as calculated or organized decisions as I used to, or feel confident in those decisions that I did make. So the second concept I want to highlight is this notion of cognitive load. And this is a term that is coined by the social psychologist Roy Baumeister. And it's a deterioration of our ability to make good decisions. Oh, wait, sorry, I have the same bullet points that I had on the last one. I'm sorry, I meant to switch this out. See, this is my cognitive load. So a couple of things I just want to talk about with cognitive load, and then I can go back and fix these slides if Michael had planned to share them. But before I talk about cognitive load, I want to just talk about the memory and how memory works. Okay, so a little bit about how we process information. So sensory memory we've got, and then we've got long-term memory, and we've got working memory. When we take in information, it's processed in our working memory, which can really only hold about 5 to 9 pieces or chunks of information at a time. So this is a limited capacity. We can only hold so many pieces of information at a given time. But we're constantly bombarded by incoming sensory information, right? Especially right now. I mean, think about the headlines. So there are lots of factors to consider and lots of information we're taking in as it relates to a lot of the decisions that we're making or ways we're trying to help our families function. So we're under this immense cognitive load, because not only is it a lot of information we're taking in, that information is also changing constantly, right? Every day I feel like I read a new interpretation of risks and benefits and a new article about the benefits of masks or not, right? The information's constantly changing, on top of the fact that it is a substantial amount of information we're taking in. So the problem when we're cognitively overloaded like this is that it consumes our attention and our mental resources. And this can be distracting, even in the best of times. It requires a lot of mental and emotional energy, and it's exhausting. It's like this invisible labor our mind is constantly doing behind the scenes. And we don't even realize how much cognitive energy we're spending on processing all that information. So when you layer on top of that the additional load that parents are managing, right? Because it's not just our lives we're responsible for, it's those of our children as well. So who's remembering what needs to be done, and whose assignment, how do I log into this platform? I don't know about for you all, but that was really overwhelming for me, is like the 10 different platforms each of my children were using through their schools and their logins and their passwords. And, it was just like a lot of those little bits of information I had to manage. So sociologists will often refer to this family management obligation or these responsibilities as worry work. And in a lot of the research studies tend to show that it's typically the mother who is bearing the brunt of this cognitive load or this worry work. Okay, so I can think of an example of an article I read a few years ago where the author was talking about, it was like 3 minutes inside or 5 minutes inside a mom's head. And it was just this stream of consciousness, right, of all these worries, like, oh, I need to get more pants for little Johnny. And oh gosh, he's growing so fast. Gosh, will he be taller than me? I wonder if he'll be bullied if he isn't very tall. And then what will that mean for college? Will he get into college? And if he doesn't get into college, what is he going to do? And like, this is the rabbit hole we go down. And I remember reading this article thinking like, wow, this is spot on, right? Like, this is what it feels like to be in my head, especially when I lay my head on the pillow at night. And when I'm supposed to be letting it all go, it's all spiraling. And I shared the article with my husband, and he read it and he was like, this is so ridiculous, right? It's so over the top. And I said, no, it is spot on. And he just went, oh God, I feel so sorry for you. Is that what it's like to be in your head all of the time? And so it was just a good example for me of which the research tends to support, that mothers tend to do much more of this cognitive load bearing of taking on this sort of worry work unintentionally. And so it's just yet another thing that kind of contributes to the stress and fatigue we've been experiencing during this time. So those are two concepts I just wanted to start with: decision fatigue and cognitive load. And these are a couple of questions I'd encourage you to just take time and think about. So to help prevent decision fatigue, what steps can you take to minimize the number of decisions you make on a daily basis? How can you reduce or share the cognitive load that you're carrying to allow you to better focus on the big decisions? And then the last one there, think about the current version of your child or your children and the current version of yourself as a parent. And how do these versions compare to, say, March, before this all began? And the reason I wanted to include that last question for you is in my conversations with parents over the last 7 months or so, there's so much of this like, well, this isn't how my child is, or, before all this never would have happened. And when will we just return to normal? And we're trying to make a lot of these decisions based on who we each were before, because this feels, or we pray, it is temporary, right? And so then things will go back to normal. Well, we're 8 months into this now. And to be honest, I don't know that we're ever going back to normal, because this is a pretty long period of time for us to be adapting and adjusting to ever really just go back to the way we were exactly before all of this. So that being said, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that, own that, because it can help the way we're making decisions now. So when it came to the school decision, was I making decisions based on who my kids were in February and the way that they function in school? Or was I making decisions based on who they are now, what they need now because of how things have changed, who I am now and what I am able to give or not give, how I can meet their needs or I'm not able to in different ways, as very different than who I was before this all began, because my responsibilities have changed. And the way I am able to allocate my time has changed. So I just encourage you to think about, the current versions of who you are and who each of your children are, as you have to make some of these decisions and think through some of the things you're encountering. And related to that, if you have more than one child, another thing I find myself often reminding parents is to stop thinking about your kids as a collective unit, right? We tend to make decisions for the family, for the children, but recognize that each of your kids is a very distinct individual and they have different strengths and needs. And so we need to go through that decision-making process, whatever it is about, for each child independently, rather than making decisions for the children. Okay, so it's just something to kind of keep in mind. So decision fatigue, cognitive load, I just want to give you a few highlights of some other topics that, kind of come to mind that I have found the psychological science to be quite helpful for me as I've gone through this with my family. So question we get all the time, how do we talk to our kids about COVID-19, right? Are we going to traumatize them if we bring it up? Should we be talking about it? If so, how should we be talking about it? So we know from research as well as everyday experiences as parents, and long ago when we were kids, way back when, that parents are really important sources of information and emotional support for kids. So our kids are looking to us for cues on how to feel about things, how to understand what's going on, what's important about this, what should I remember? They're looking to their parents for cues about that. Now, for those of you who have older kids, teenagers, young adults, we know that for them, that's less the case, that they're much more inclined to look to their peers for information and support. But even if that is the perception that you have and that's accurate for your tween or your teen or your young adult, parents are still pretty darn important sources of information for their kids. Even if those older kids won't necessarily acknowledge that, they are still taking cues from you in ways you might not realize, even though it seems that their whole worldview tends to come from their peers. So this is even more important right now because we're in this period in many ways of sort of social isolation, physical distancing from others. So our kids have been cut off from various other sources of information and support that they're used to getting, especially in the beginning of this, right? They were cut off from coaches and teachers and friends. And so it made parents even more important than ever in terms of being the source of information for their kids and helping their kids to make sense of all of this. So a lot of these things that I'm going to share and questions and prompts that I'll share with you in just a bit don't just apply to COVID-19 or these pandemic conversations. A lot of the things we'll talk about, work for really any difficult topic that you have to talk about with your child, any traumatic experience, just anything that kids might be encountering or difficult things going on in the world. A lot of these, sort of tips and ways of thinking about it can apply beyond just COVID-19. So again, we're the ones that tend to share information with our kids. And there's a fair bit of research that shows that children are affected by how parents react and what they say about stressful events. So as I said, they take their cue from us. And so the more we can prepare our kids for stressful events, to create space and freedom for them to ask us about it, the better off they will be in the long run. It lowers their anxiety. It helps them know what to expect as much as we can convey that. And they tend to show less distress over time when parents are having, open and honest conversations at developmentally appropriate levels for their kids. Okay. So you might be concerned about like how to bring up these kinds of things. Should I bring it up? And how do I do that? But I just want to sort of reinforce for you that the important take home here is that at least what we found from the research when it comes to other disasters and trauma, avoiding the topic is what is not helpful. Okay, there are better and worse ways to talk about it, to bring it up, but not talking about it at all is actually not helpful. And in some cases can be even harmful for kids because they don't have the ability or opportunity to process what's going on. Kids are going to hear things anyway. And now that our kids are back in school in whatever format, they're interacting with other kids and their teachers. And so they're going to overhear things. They're going to have conversations with kids, with their peers, which may be uninformed. They're going to see things, they're talking to other people. And so they need to have that parental influence there to be able to help them make sense of all the different things they're sort of hearing and what they should believe and not believe. Okay. So not only is it okay to talk with your kids about some of these COVID related issues, you should be, right? And so there are ways to do that and sort of invite the conversation, remind them that you're always happy to answer questions that they have. It may not be that just because you bring it up that they're in a headspace where they're really gung-ho to have the conversation in a really in-depth way right then, but at least they know that you're open to it and you're there if and when they do want to talk about it or they have questions. Now, again, depending on your kids' developmental stages or ages, that'll come up in different ways. You might have younger kids asking questions over and over again, the same questions, and you find yourself kind of repeating. Sometimes that's their way of seeking reassurance. Sometimes it's just their short-term memories. They don't remember that we talked about this really difficult thing 2 days ago, even though you do. And so, it's okay to answer the same questions over and over again, because sometimes that's a way for us to like get a sense of, okay, they must be worried about this. This is something on their mind that they keep bringing it up. So that last, excuse me, point there you see about what about when kids ask questions we aren't prepared for? This comes up a lot, right? Parents are so worried about, what if I say the wrong thing? What if I explain it in the wrong way? What if I make it worse because of the way I've explained it? And again, I go back to, like, there are very few things we can't undo. And it is great modeling for your kids to, let's say they catch you off guard with a really difficult question, or one that you're just like, oh, I don't know how to answer that. It's okay to buy yourself time. It's okay to say to them, I'm so glad you asked me that. That is a really important question. If it's okay with you, I just want to take some time to think about it to make sure I answer you in the best way possible. So would it be okay if we, save that for dinner and I can kind of give it some thought before we talk about it? Buy yourself time. That's okay. Or if you sort of answer abruptly because you're so caught off guard, and then as you think about it, you're thinking, that wasn't the best way to handle that, or I wish I would have explained it differently. You can always come back later and say, you remember when you asked me about such and such and I told you such and such? I've thought about it a lot since then, and I think I want to add to that answer. Would that be okay? Or I'm not sure I answered that in the best way. Is this an okay time for me to kind of explain a little bit more about what I meant? Like, we get do-overs. And again, it is great modeling for your kids to see that, like, oh, wow, sometimes my parents don't know the answer, or sometimes they have to think about it, or they get it wrong. And I think it just is another opportunity for them to see that, like, it's okay to get it wrong sometimes. It's okay to acknowledge when you don't know, which are really important lessons to teach our kids all throughout their education. So here are just some question prompts for you. I get asked a lot about, like, well, how do I bring this up? Or how do I ask them about it? And, you want to be careful to not sort of impose your fears, worries, or assumptions about how your kids are feeling, but instead to open it up to really get a sense of how they're feeling. So instead of saying, are you really worried or, nervous that you're going to get COVID? Instead, asking that in an open-ended way that doesn't assume feelings or put words to something they might not be feeling. Instead, saying something like, well, how do you feel about what's happening with the coronavirus? Or, yeah, tell me what you think about it. Have you guys been talking about it at school? What are your thoughts? What are some things you think we can do at home to stay safe? So these are just some prompts to kind of give you to open the conversation with kids of different ages, remembering that, we want to, as best as we can, keep it open and let them use the words and terms and feelings that they have. And then we take our cue from that instead of imposing ours. So the few takeaways here: don't avoid talking about COVID with your kids. Encourage your kids to talk to you by using open-ended questions. Encourage them to ask you questions and do your best to answer them in really developmentally appropriate ways. So, hey, what questions do you have for me? Or are there things you've been wondering about that we haven't talked about yet? Or have you heard anything that you're not really sure what that means? Encourage them to ask you questions. And then the last piece is that I would really encourage you to limit your kids' exposure, especially the younger kids, to news and other media about the pandemic, because it is so catastrophic, right? The headlines, the news stories, every day we're seeing more reports of death rates, mortality rates, infection rates. So it's enough already to manage. So when they have questions, that's great. But I would encourage you to not overexpose them to a lot of the media coverage of all kinds of things going on in the world right now, because there is quite a bit of research that has demonstrated, how that adversely impacts kids, especially in these times of extreme vulnerability. Okay. All right, so 2 more points I just want to make, and then we should have plenty of time for questions. So one is just to talk about the notion of grief, which I think has been a really important psychological concept that not everybody has known to name what's been going on for them. So I want to just name this for you, that this is, for many of us, what we have been feeling and haven't known to call it that. Okay, so what is grief? Grief is basically our natural reaction to a loss. It's not limited to just the loss of people, which is where we usually associate it, right? When somebody dies, we call that grief. So it isn't just associated with that. It's associated really with any type of loss. So the grief process also looks different for each of us. All of us experience grief at some point in our lives. Some experience it more intense than others. So the typical things we tend to grieve, of course, are the death of a loved one, maybe a relationship, loss of a job or loss of income, pets. Maybe we grieve our health if we have a long-term, illness, something like that, lost opportunities. But right now in a pandemic, there's a grief expert who I recently heard in a podcast that David Kessler is his name. And it was in his podcast with Brene Brown, where he said, we don't even have enough time to count the losses we're all encountering right now. And that really stayed with me, that we are grieving so much since this began. the amount of things we have lost, from the very simple, the ability to buy toilet paper when we need it, right? All the way up through, of course, the catastrophic, losing a loved one to COVID, becoming really ill yourself. So I just wanted to sort of, highlight that grief is what's going on for a lot of us. We just haven't known to call it that. But what I want to just briefly do is distinguish between types of grief, and then I'll come back to some of these other questions. So normal grief looks like gradually sort of accepting loss while you're still able to function in your daily activities. Traumatic grief is an abrupt, unexpected loss in a pretty tragic way that can cause really substantial distress, okay? There's also what's known as complicated grief, where the feelings of loss are debilitating and don't improve over time. And then there is collective grief, which is grief felt by a community, a society, a nation. And I would certainly argue that we are feeling collective grief right now. And one of the really interesting comparisons I read recently in an article was, if we think about how we responded after 9/11, right? We came together as a nation, we really sort of rallied and supported each other. We felt community, we felt unity. I don't know about for you, but that's certainly not what this has felt, right? It's been very divided as to how people respond, behave in response to this pandemic. And so while we are maybe feeling this collective grief in a shared way, we're experiencing it very differently. And it isn't in the same sort of supportive, coming together, unifying spirit that we saw after, say, our most recent national crisis, or global crisis. Okay, so just wanted you to have an idea of some of these different types of grief. But if we go back to thinking about, how do I know if what I or my kids are experiencing is grief? So some of that has to do with how long it's lasting, right? So grief, again, is a normal response to what's going on. And when you start to feel some of these aspects of sadness and loss and, I miss this, or longing for these experiences or sense of normalcy or whatever it is you might be grieving. And there are many things, as I said, that we're grieving. I'll show you a few more examples in just a bit. So I want you to think about, what sorts of things are you grieving? What are your kids grieving? Those may not be the same. I was really sad for my kids, which is ironic, right? As much as I complain about driving them to all of their activities, I grieved that for them. And in some ways, I wondered if I was grieving it for them more than they even were. But for me, it was because I know this is their physical release. I have 3 boys, for crying out loud. That's a lot of energy in our house. And they did not have the physical release they were used to having. It's a sense of competence for them. They enjoy sports. They feel like they do a good job at them. And at a time when we were fighting every day over remote learning assignments that they didn't feel competence or mastery over. So I really grieved for them, some of these activities they were used to being in. I don't know that they necessarily grieved the same things. I think they missed their friends more than they necessarily missed activities. But again, these are conversations I was having with parents a lot, throughout the spring and summer, around grieving things like your child's prom or moving your child in at college, like these things that you also imagined for your kids for their whole lives were losses for you too, because they didn't get to happen in the way that you imagined or envisioned. So the sorts of things that you're grieving might be different than what your kids are grieving, and that's okay. And just sort of recognizing what we each are grieving and how that may overlap or may be quite different. And then the last point I just want to make here is that grief and growth go hand in hand. Like, grief is an inevitable part of life. It's something we're going to repeatedly encounter. So grief is not the problem. We shouldn't be afraid of our children experiencing grief. It's the traumatic or complicated grief that can cause longer term problems that I talked about. But we have to be allowed to feel the pain of our loss in order to grow from it, and to acknowledge at times that it's okay to not be okay. And again, these are really critical lessons our kids are learning from us, that we are able to help steer them through their grief too, and say, it's okay to be upset about this. It's okay to be sad that you didn't get to have this opportunity. I'm sad for you too. That is what we're modeling, that it's okay to not be okay, and that it's actually important to allow yourself to go through that grief process and acknowledge it. So another thing I want to just mention, to compound the grief, this was a meme that really cracked me up at the end of August, right? As I thought about, oh man, all the things that are going to keep happening, right? So this is Melissa McCarthy, and it says, me writing into the end of August, wondering what fresh hell September will bring us, right? And it was a friend named this for me. She said, I think what you're feeling is anticipatory distress. It's like you're just waiting for the next shoe to drop. And it was like, well, yeah, because the shoes keep dropping. It just keeps being something else in 2020. So because of that, I found myself, and I know many friends, in this state of just like, we're constantly on edge and hypervigilant about what the next awful thing's going to be. And so that is exhausting too. So you're feeling grief about the things you've lost, and you're feeling this constant anticipatory distress, like anticipating it's going to be bad. This next thing's going to be bad, or what is the next thing? And that is emotionally exhausting. And so to be able to sort of recognize that is key to then prevent it from turning into something like depression. And so these are just some tips and just ideas around recognizing that if we don't tend to our grief process, there is a risk of it becoming depression or something more serious. So these are just some good reminders around ways to help you work through some of that grief, whatever layers it takes on, to be able to stave off, hopefully, something like a more serious depressive episode, which, if that does happen, there is help for that too. So it doesn't mean that you've done anything wrong, that you didn't fight hard enough to keep it from becoming depression. It can absolutely become depression, and boy, would that be understood right now. And there are resources to help you with that, to help your kids with that, if you're worried about that, that's what it's turning into for them, that this has gone farther than just being maybe a typical grief process, but really has started to move over into the realm of potentially depressive symptoms. So these are just some tips for you there. So I just wanted to mention there were a couple things. Like I said, there were lots of things we could be grieving. This is a wonderful infographic from an Instagram account I love, which is _happy as a mother. So she's a clinician that makes all these wonderful infographics and images. I think just naming a lot of the things we're feeling and some of these concepts that I've been talking about. So here she's highlighting it's okay to grieve things like your canceled vacation, your trip, your baby shower, your graduation, your child's birthday party, time with loved ones, your wedding, your birth plan. There's lots of things we have lost in the last 7 and 8 months. And so to just give yourself permission to grieve those things and to not feel shame around. I know it's silly. I know people have it a lot worse. It's silly for me to be sad that I didn't get to have my prom. It's not silly. That's something that was really important to you. And you don't need to minimize feeling that just because you're also trying to keep perspective that, yes, it could be worse. And certainly others have it a lot worse off. But that doesn't mean you're not allowed to feel sad, or grieve something that was important to you. Okay. So good enough parenting is another concept I want to introduce to you. This idea of what we're expecting of ourselves right now. And is that reasonable, right? Are we thinking about the parent that I was in February and trying to hold ourselves to that standard right now in the midst of all of these things going on that I've been talking about for the last hour or so? So just things like mom guilt and how this is a phenomenon, again, the research tends to indicate is more prevalent for moms, feeling lots of guilt and shame around things I should be able to do right now or I should be doing, not recognizing that, again, I am in the middle of a global crisis and getting my family through that day by day. So all of those things I should be able to do should probably go out the window at this point, right? The judgment we tend to put on ourselves. So this notion of good enough parenting was coined by the British pediatrician D.W. Winnicott in his famous book, Playing in Reality. And so good enough parenting is this idea that, we have a good amount of research that tells us what kids need at sort of a bare minimum in order to thrive, function, develop. What are the things that they need? And the things that we often hold ourselves to are so far and above what the research indicates people need, kids need, right? So what is good enough parenting? And what are our expectations of ourselves right now? So good enough parenting, I would argue, looks quite different in a pandemic than it might in other contexts when we have all the sort of resources and predictability at our disposal. So it's just sort of thinking about what does good enough look like for us and our family right now? And recognizing that that's probably okay in most contexts. So it looks different for different children in different families. Children, of course, differ in their needs, but typically for all children, good enough parenting means physical needs are taken care of. So housing, clothing, food, medical care. They have safety in their community as best as can be managed. They're safe in their families, in their homes. The mental and physical health of a parent, that they're nurtured, that they are learning some flexibility and adaptability from their parents, and that these kids have the ability to seek and accept support when needed. That's good enough parenting, right? Not that they have the most recent version of the Chromebook, not that you are sitting and staring lovingly at them for 8 straight hours while they do their remote learning, right? Like, good enough parenting means their basic human needs are taken care of, layered with nurturing, love and support. That's good enough parenting. But the standard we hold ourselves to is often so much more than that. So what does that look like in a pandemic? I want to talk a little bit about just this idea of resilience and level setting our expectations, okay? Because sometimes we think that good enough parenting means my kids can't ever experience stress. I need to protect them from all of these things going on around them. But stress actually helps us build resilience. And I'm going to show you a clip from one of our guest experts, Dr. Bruce Perry, in just a minute. And one of the things that he's a child psychiatrist, internationally renowned trauma expert. And one of the things I had learned from Dr. Perry years ago was this notion of stress can actually be helpful to build resilience. It's not that we want to protect our kids from stress. It's that we want to make sure they are experiencing stress in these manageable doses. Okay, so stress that is predictable, moderate, performance, right? A dance recital that is stressful and they have stage fright, but it is predictable, moderate, and controlled, and it's good for them to have these experiences and build up and be able to manage and work through that and cope with the anxiety. And so, we are trying to foster situations where our kids can build up their resilience to stressful experiences, okay? Obviously, the situation we're in right now, prolonged, chronic, lots of uncertainty, we don't have control over it, is not optimal. But it doesn't mean that we can't create experiences or try to build in some control around what's happening in our homes to help our kids build their resilience. So how does this look different for each of your kids? If you sort of think about how do we create opportunities for what Dr. Perry would refer to as dosed stress for our kids to help them build resilience? How might that look different for each of your different children? This certainly looks different for each of my kids and how I think about what kinds of situations make them feel stress or nervous. And then how do I create situations or help them work through situations, that impact them each differently. Okay. And then what does that look like for you? So in what situations are manageable stress that help you build your resilience versus, maybe situations that just feel so out of our control that I do need some extra help with that, or I need to attend to what I'm feeling in that a bit more. Okay, so these are just some things I want you to think about, and I will end with some advice from Dr. Perry around what are our expectations right now for our families. What does it look like in a pandemic to be a good enough parent, and what should we be expecting of our kids?
Let's talk about expectations, right? And what you really want to do is sort of focus on what are the core needs that these kids have right now. The core need is that they need to feel loved and they need to feel safe. And so honestly, whatever it takes for you to make your kid feel loved and safe, whether it's like, more hugs, doing more things with them, if there are expectations that you feel are getting in the way of your child feeling good about themselves, feeling like learning is fun, learning is good, you should stop them. And you should notify your school that this is your experience, this is your opinion, this is your, you just think that it makes things worse when you have these unrealistic expectations.
So here are a couple more questions just for you. Again, I invite you to sort of take these back into your home, reflect on them yourself, reflect on them with your partner, with fellow, parent friends, people who work with kids. What sorts of things have you been feeling guilty about during the pandemic? And are they different from things you might have felt guilty about before the pandemic? What does good enough parenting look like for you right now? What are some ways that you can shift the expectations that you hold for yourself and your family while we get through this? And then knowing that stress can help children build resilience when it's predictable, moderate, and controlled, what are some stressors your child is exposed to that fit these resilience building criteria? And to not be afraid of those, but instead help our kids work through them. So I hope some of this was just helpful. Again, they're just sort of snippets of resources that we've been cranking out at Pandemic Parenting. These are the social media accounts. And again, you just saw a little clip from one of the webinars that we have been trying to share in real time as fast as we can. So I encourage you to follow our social media accounts, sign up for the email newsletter on the website, pandemic-parent.org. And we will always be sharing these resources for free. And encourage you to submit questions and topics you want us to tackle in the weeks and months ahead. And then the last bit there is, this is an entirely free service, and because our goal is to give psychology away in ways that help people right now. So Lindsay and I donate all of our time to this, but we actually have this incredible team of mostly Valpo alums, believe it or not, either current students or recent graduates or early career professionals that do all the behind the scenes amazing work. They do the website, they do all the social media, they do all the video editing. And so I just ask you to consider if you are able to contribute in any amount to help us support this team that is allowing and enabling us to do this work to continue helping parents, to please consider doing so. And we would be most grateful so that we can keep up the work for as long as we can and as long as it is helpful. Okay, so I will end there and see if we have any questions that have come in.
I am checking the chat. It doesn't look like there's anything that's come in. Just a reminder, if you've got anything that you want to ask Dr. Zelechoski, to put it in the chat or email us. We'll give it a couple seconds here. Anything? I know there's a little bit of a delay, so I want to give it enough,
no
enough
problem.
time.
I get it. That's what happens in Zoom land.
Well, it looks like we don't have anything coming in, so we'll let the webinar end here. Thank you so much, Dr. Zelechoski, for presenting to us this evening. Sounds like some really great work that you all are doing over at pandemicparent.org. So with that, thank you to everyone out in YouTube land and Zoom land for coming in and joining us for this event, and check out alumni.valpo.edu for more events that we have coming up on our calendar. So, and if, as I'm thinking of it, if you have any topics that you'd like to hear a webinar on or anything like that, whether it's something continuing with parenting during the pandemic or anything else, please make sure to email us at alumni@valpo.edu and let us know as well. And with that, we wish you all a good night and stay safe and healthy.